Hi, this is Keeper, a show exploring castles and video games. I'm your host, Gavin Davis, joined by my good friend, the castle expert, Alison Norton. Today, we take a dive into Castle Dimitrescu in Resident Evil 8 Village and discuss, amongst other things, Gothic castles, castles as national symbols, and castles in tourism. Enjoy! You haven't played many Resident Evil games, right?
I haven't played a single one of them. I have read the storylines, so I know the gist.
Mm-hmm. Well, this one was a bit of a radical departure, because in previous games they've gone for a kind of Night of the Living Dead thing. But
I would say like radical departure.
A radical departure, yeah. So there's no longer any zombies, it's all gothic horror monsters, a bit of the occult. I remember there being news leaked from developers on the team suspecting that it was going to be controversial, but actually turns out it was far from controversial. It was actually kind of embraced because Resident Evil had gone a bit stagnant, almost become a bit like a zombie itself, just sort of wandering around and it's not really knowing where it was going. So it was kind of refreshing to have this, this new take, or like a reinvention, I guess, of the series. Here's the exterior. This is what the first thing you see of Castle Dimitrescu going in. We know that it's based off loosely based off a real castle in Romania.
Loosely based off Palace Castle in Romania.
Yeah.
Though there's really nothing to it to suggest that it's modeled directly off of it. I mean, I suppose it was sort of inspired, but to say to what extent is subjective. It just has this sort of gothic, Baroque, even Romanesque style about it. So it's combining everything from the medieval all the way up until the 18th century, even the 19th century, to be perfectly honest. A lot of the sort of medievalism that comes out of this period is all about this horror. Because it's when science fiction starts to become a thing with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and Dracula. Medievalism, just to be perfectly clear.
For the uninitiated.
There you go. That's the word.
Because not everybody, this is the thing, we can't assume that everybody's going to be a big castle. Well, you are the castle expert in this case. I'm a castle aficionado, maybe. Only insofar as the existing games and back home in Wales. Otherwise, castles don't really kind of. Again, thinking about it, the reason we're sort of doing this is that and you play video games. I'm myopically interested in video games. It occurs to me that. I'm lucky enough to live somewhere where castles are pretty abundant. But obviously you're from somewhere where castles
don't exist.
Exactly.
At all.
Ironically, most of the castles that I've encountered in my life, really, are through games. And it's one of these things where you think, well, castles are pretty mundane, they're in fiction and fantasy, they're in films. So people see castles a lot, they're pretty ubiquitous. But I think with games it's interesting that you're actually exploring them most of the time. You're infiltrating them, you're trespassing, which historically would be unheard of. Yeah, a friend of mine, my good friend Jack, pretty great points. He brought this up, so all credit goes to him. This idea that, I'm telling you, I'm preaching the inverted, but castles are historically these impregnable spaces, but in games they need to be penetrable. That's grim imagery, but it's apt, right? They have to be spaces you explore, so they have to give the impression of being difficult because they have to challenge, but you do inevitably have to be able to kind of get inside them and explore and usurp the ruler or whatever, depending on what the game is.
Yeah. Well, with castles, we have to remember there's so many ideas of what they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to look, how they're supposed to function, and that's pretty much what we get from the moment we see them, about the 900s. Again, that's an overgeneralization, but let's just say 900s for the sake of argument and for simplicity's sake. And we see them all the way through, even till today. And as Gavin said, we see them a lot in games, in films, TV shows, but they all have to be inspired by something. There's something that's giving the creators and the directors inspiration, and that's typically from either fiction itself or from places that you can go visit, to the historical castles. And with medievalism is a movement that's happening commonly in the 19th century, but we see it throughout the early modern period, which is about 1500 to 1800, and it's people want to sort of revisit a time when their culture was so grand and so inspiring and just something to be very proud of. It promoted this nationalistic or even individualistic identity. And they want to go back to that time, so they bring it into the modern day. And they bring it into the modern day in a very fantastical, very elaborate image,
Mm-hmm.
which is why we see these fairy tale castles like this sort of gothic horror castle. It's all inspired from that medievalist movement. For this one in particular, it is very reminiscent of that time of science fiction with all that horror coming out of the literary movements with Mary Shelley, Robert Louis Stevenson, even Bram Stoker.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a good foundation to build from where we want to escape the realist, I suppose, realist world, movement, ideology.
Well, just reality, I suppose. It's sort of escapism. That's the way I'd see it. I mean, if I can interject.
Interject away.
What I find fascinating from my personal experience, and it's why we should do this, is that back home there are plenty of castles, but they're all just ruins, right? I mean, my hometown is a castle, but and over the centuries it's been used for various other purposes other than to being a castle. But what little of it remains gives a faint semblance, like a faint idea of what of its former glory. I think that's the case for most castles in Wales. I know there are some exceptions. There are some beautiful castles like Caerphilly, which are they're still standing, but many others there's just the hint of what they once were. Whereas in other places, castles still stand, and of course those castles, like for example the one this is seemingly based off of, the Romanian one. That's maybe where this is Resident Evil Village is an interesting starting point for this, because not only do we have a castle that, as you say, is it's not strictly a medieval castle. It's this sort of neo-Renaissance, mock Gothic kind of castle, based off one. If it is Castle Pelles, is built in the 19th century for King Carol I, who I believe, I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, first king of Romania, built it as a sort of a summer palace, summer home. Some of the interior shots, which I can put in post, bear some resemblance to the interiors in Castle Dimitrescu. I guess that's why it's interesting to get your take on it, because it's a castle, but it's like a kind of a facsimile, or it's a kind of invention, almost like a fairy tale castle, like you say. So where do you draw the kind of lines then between what is a castle proper and what is this kind of, like, is a castle necessarily something from the Middle Ages, or is a castle just like a type of building, like a type of abode, or a type of, what is a castle?
I don't think you can actually draw a clear-cut line of what is and what isn't a castle, just because that idea does change throughout time, depending on the needs of a person, depending on the needs of a community or a region. There is no clear-cut, this is, this isn't. And we are increasingly becoming aware of that in academia and castle studies, which is where I am. And part of my project is to look at, well, what ideas should we be looking at in terms of a castle? Is there a medieval? Is there an early modern? Is there a Victorian postmodern, or what have you? And what I'm finding from the medieval period is, specifically in England post-conquest, it is something that has to act administratively, residentially, and defensively. It has to be something that's intrinsically Norman. So something very different. And the only reason why they call it a castle is because they need to distinguish it from structures that they're familiar with. But as we continue through the medieval period, it tends to take on this more elaborate residential phase where it's not supposed to be defensive in the sense that it will thwart oncoming attacks. It's more of a design feature versus a necessity. Interesting.
Yeah, that's the thing, because it's a kind of a pastiche almost.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's interesting in this game they call it Castle Dimitrescu rather than...
Well, you got to think of what the word castle invokes.
Right, exactly.
It invokes status, it invokes power, puts you and your home and your family above everyone else. So there is this sort of need to say, well, this is a castle because of that idea that it promotes. If you just said, here's my home, well, good for you. Doesn't mean anything. If you just said, here's my manor house, I could come along and go, well, that's cute, here's my castle. It's just like a one-upsmanship of, it's so elaborate, it's so grand compared to whatever you live in.
Well, they say that a man, a woman's as well, a person's home is their castle, right?
Exactly.
Which is kind of a sort of fluid concept. And in this case, I mean, this castle is quite literally the home of notoriously provocative Resident Evil villain Lady Dimitrescu, Alcina Dimitrescu, who I think exploded it over the internet. I forget what year we're in now, 2022. This game came out
2021.
Came out in 2021, did it? Or was it 20? Oh, it's literally there on the screen. Perfect. Last year, then, my God, last year, or the year before, whenever the game was first announced, they made a big deal of. Well, they didn't make a big deal. They didn't make a big deal of her. She just appeared, and it seemed to tap into just the internet's latent thirstiness. Just everybody started to kind of create fan art around her and kind of sort of weigh on this kind of dominatrix figure, but she sort of, I guess she is. She's this kind of, again, archetypical
very authoritative woman.
Yeah, like a femme fatale. She's sort of a mix of Dracula with I can't pronounce the name or remember it, but there's a character in Japanese urban legend who's an 8-foot tall woman. I think the Japanese name is literally just 8-foot tall woman, and she's also dressed in white. She preys on wayward children and just sort of eats them or something.
But I mean, taking that sort of a character whose sole purpose is to invoke fear and dread. When you see her, you go, oh crap, and you sort of run away from her. But when you first walk in, I mean, look at this. I mean, look at the architecture here. Baroque, Rococo. It's so grand, it's so elaborate, it's gilded everywhere. And you get these 3 sort of demure, innocent-looking women. They're completely playing off this sort of emotion of, no, it's inviting, come in. Whereas when you looked outside, you saw the exterior of the castle, and it's the last place you want it to be. Snowy, ruinous, dark, dread, dreary. But on the inside, you have a warm fireplace, you have inviting colors, everything's bright, and we get welcomed with this lovely little family portrait, it seems.
Yeah, sort of a kind of a juxtaposition of the reality, Dimitrescu's quote-unquote her daughters, her surrogate daughters, are kind of reminiscent of like Macbeth's witches, the 3 of them. I mean, much like Castle Palace in Romania, this is the by far the grandest setting, like location in the game. The rest of it is like a sort of medieval village. The whole point of this game is that it's a remote Eastern European village. Never specified exactly where it is. Much the same way as in Resident Evil 4, way back when it was sort of in a remote part of Europe, but it's implicitly Spain. It's a place untouched by time.
Yeah.
And of course, what's interesting is that it's real life inspiration. Mid to late 19th century is meant to. There's a whole history behind that with King Carol I. He wanted to. It's as much about stressing his identity in his new homeland that he's ruling. So that is also evoking a kind of an imagined past. Whereas here, though, we've stepped into somewhere that's totally anachronistic, totally out of sync with the rest of the world, for various reasons in the game that are explained that are probably too nebulous and niche to get into.
That's the beauty of a castle in a video game, a castle in a TV show, or even a movie. It doesn't have to fit the sort of tangible castles we can go visit where the emotion is pretty much the same. You want people to come to it. It's very inviting. Please visit. It's driven now by the tourist market, but the games don't have to be. They can play in their own reality, and they can have various realities and various landscapes throughout one scene or even like the entire game. That's the beauty of them. You're constantly engaging with various sort of storylines, emotions, and even characters that represent some part of the director's idea of what this world should be.
Well, that is also interesting because again, what we've got going on here in Castle Dimitrescu is a kind of a what are we getting here? It's a Japanese game. That's the stress. Capcom, they published it. One of their studios developed it. So you're getting this sort of vision of Eastern Europe through a kind of like a Japanese developer's eyes. So I'm sure they've done the research. Again, they've found inspiration in real world counterparts. The way I see it is that it's almost a kind of a reverse of Orientalism. It's like an Occidentalism. It's sort of like an exaggerated image of what Europe is like, what's quintessentially European, and what's more quintessentially European than a medieval castle, or a kind of a mock Gothic, which is a castle.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating talking about tourism and the idea that castles they ineluctably draw people towards them, because what better example is there of that than Disneyland or Disney World? I haven't been to any of them. But
any of them.
Really. And they have the castle, don't they? Like it's like what do they call it? A weenie. Have you ever heard of that? A weenie? So Disney's Imagineers, they create these kind of focal points that people gravitate towards inexorably. And the castle, you see it, massive thing. Can you even go in the castle?
You can.
Okay. Yeah,
you can stay in it.
Right, you can stay in it, you can go, you can see it everywhere, it kind of grounds you, it's a bit to look at. And much the same as in this game, you know, Castle Dimitrescu is up on the mountain, up on some kind of plateau, outcrop overlooking the rest of the village, which I mean, I guess is
it's very Eastern European, where it's like on this sort of mountain, the mountainous landscape, the wooded landscape. So like Bran Castle in Romania is notoriously known as Dracula's castle. We have mountain ranges, we have the woodland, it's very remote looking, it's sort of separate from its own village, even though there is one that's tied to it. But Castle Dimitrescu is doing the same thing, where you can go through any country in Eastern Europe and find very similar landscapes. So they did their homework on that one, and they did it very well.
Because just to look at some of these interiors, they are, well, they certainly, they kind of deviate from what I would stereotypically expect from a castle. I expect stonemasonry everywhere to be kind of cold and forbidding. And of course, you know, there are plenty of games that do that, but it's interesting here that contrary to the exterior, like you say, it's kind of warm, it's wooden, it does bear semblance to Castle Palace in Romania. Far from what I would have expected. Very decadent, but also kind of, you can see like in the interiors of the sort of peeling wallpaper, this idea that it's kind of seen better days, much like you think of any kind of vampiric castle or gothic castle is sort of, there's a suggestion of former glory, but it's kind of mouldering and it's wilting.
We're playing a lot into that dark lacquered wood instead of like, we have brightly colored floors and wallpaper, but don't let it trick you, because this is supposed to be some place that you feel a little unease going through.
It must be said that I had to crank up the brightness for these screenshots, which makes the castle look far more appealing than it really is in the game. It's very dark otherwise and forbidding, which is by design, isn't it? Because it's a survival horror game. But it actually looks really, really nice. As if you could sort of wander around it like we are doing now, I suppose, virtually. Like it's a heritage space. I mean, look at the, you know, you can see there's busts everywhere. There's, beautiful herringbone paneling on the floor.
Yeah.
Again,
and so that sort of dark heritage is what it's called when people want to go visit places of suffering or places of sort of dread, as it were, which is why a lot of people are very interested in battlements, or sorry, not battlements, battles. They go to battlefields. They want these war-torn places to visit. And with castles, it's not structurally sound to leave them in ruins, let you go through them. It's also not going to drive up prices if we just sort of say, well, you know, it's a very dark, ominous castle, come to see us. So what they do is they brighten it up on the outside. They make it very inviting. Once you get in, the stories and sort of the spaces that you're engaging with, you're being led through the castle. You're going on this scripted story of, yes, and this, especially for Bran Castle, Dracula, the famous legend, and they'll walk you through it, and they'll talk about how this was his headquarters, and how he used the castle. We see that a lot, in particular with ghost stories, haunted castles. There's such a drive. So no wonder people want to play this game, aside from its great sort of story and connection to the rest of it, Resident Evil. The castle is so alluring because of that. We want to know more about it. We want to know why it's haunted. We want to know why they sort of live there and haven't left.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another thing interesting, making that connection between kind of heritage tours, guided, you know, I mean, that is the kind of sine qua non of level design. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm not a game developer, admittedly. I'm one of many people just throwing their opinion into the mix. But playing it, you certainly get the impression that it is guided to an extent, and it slowly unfolds and opens up, and new pathways emerge. I mean, what I'm describing is basically just basic level design. But even playing through Dimitrescu today now to get all the footage, to get all the photography, it's interesting how spaces that are previously guarded off for whatever reason open up, and it suddenly changes your how you map the space in your mind. So what starts off, as we have done, going through, say, the first corridor, we're now in not the entrance. Well, we're in the first entrance hall you go to with the statues, the 4 statues. This is where you first meet the 3 daughters, Dimitrescu's 3 daughters.
The witches.
The witches, yeah, who drag you off and take you off to Dimitrescu's abode, her bedroom, which is very ornate, very, kind of, it's almost filigreed. Could be quite cozy in some respects. I don't know how the heck she fits inside that bed, given that she's 8 foot, 9 foot, I don't know how tall she is, but that's the point. She's a vampire. She probably doesn't need to sleep, or something resembling a vampire. But you can see it's all blood spattered. There's thought has gone into here about how to tell the story through in the environment. Blood spatters. I took this photo from the point when Ethan is being
hung up by his hands.
By his hands, like a bit of meat, yeah. Which was terrible for Ethan, but it was great for us because it meant that I could get all these great shots of like the ceiling and and stuff on the wall and the fireplace. So I hope it was worth it. I think Ethan would agree it was worth it. Yeah, very Rococo, kind of Baroque. Almost like sort of Versailles in a way. Something very.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean this is Europe. What am I talking about? Very European. Incidentally, Resident Evil has this thing for including lots of paintings. A lot of ones that I suspect are public domain and are real paintings, or kind of like, edited versions of real ones to make them more congruent with the game. I believe they are out there. I think there's a great website which I'm sorry I can't remember, but I will put it in post, where they've included a list of all the real paintings that appear in games. I know Judith and Holofernes appears in one, and it's misnamed as something like Woman in Love with a Dead Man, which is there's no relation to the painting, but it's another way that they use them to kind of tell a story just through the environment, just through the kind of the architecture. So if anyone recognises any of these paintings I'm going to put on the screen now, let us know.
Put it in the comments.
Put in the comments, yeah. Let us know. Look, genuinely, that isn't a.
That's the only reason. That's the only way they can let us know.
Well, it's the only way they can let us know, and it's not.
They can phone in.
And I genuinely want to know because I don't think it's common knowledge, but yeah. Anyway, so we see sort of here the typical kind of gothic trope of grandeur offset by a kind of morbidity, decay.
Yeah, and in video games, and in particular heritage. Well, no, in video games. Gothic style architecture is almost synonymous with morbidity. There's not one chance that they won't have to throw in a Gothic arch or Gothic window. Especially if you go into some of the chapels and you see the balustrades and the flying buttresses. It has this sort of dark almost emotion to it, even though it's architecturally gorgeous. Almost reminiscent of the classical period as well. But for some reason, I'm sure other people know this, I just don't happen to at the moment. Gothic is that sort of architectural style you're going to go with should you want a level of horror. Yeah,
you wouldn't really see it with like classical architecture, as in like Greco-Roman. To my knowledge, that doesn't really evoke, to my mind anyway, horror the same way that your average Gothic castle.
Fantastical architecture.
Yeah.
If you let's go back to Disneyland for a minute.
Okay. To the horror.
Right. Oh, the horror, the prices will get you every time. Disneyland is based off of Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany, which is again built in the 19th century by King Ludwig II, the Mad King. But it was built because he wanted to promote a time when Germany and Bavaria were this cultural icon, and it's almost him going, look how, to use the modern word, German I am. I'm so connected to our past, and I want to be very proud of it, as we all should. Well, then Disney models their castles right off of it. But it's Gothic architecture. It's the fantastical fairy tale version of Gothic architecture. So the exterior of this castle is very high Renaissance, neo-Gothic, mixture of Baroque and Rococo. I mean, it's basically every architectural movement you have from the 16th century. So it's playing very much into all of the emotions, all of the identities that these architectural movements are trying to promote, this cultural, social significance of it. Yet, it's playing into the pop culture ideology of Gothic equals dread and sort of this sort of horror-filled.
Yeah, and you have to wonder why, don't you? Because that's interesting, because I suppose that what Neuschwanstein symbolises is castle as national symbol, so there's nationalism, the building's been used to communicate a certain imagined history, a certain imagined past, a collective past that everybody's going to see. It's very conspicuous in a castle on the hill, a castle on the mountain, that everybody's going to kind of gravitate towards. And of course, centuries afterwards becomes a heritage space, so it's sort of accrues meaning. It sort of collects it, aggregates it even, and it's interesting then this idea of coming back to the battlefield thing you mentioned earlier. This idea that people are drawn to like dark heritage. Some would suggest that these places are traumatic.
So yeah, when we get into the dungeons, we have the rack, we have the exsanguination tools, and we have these wonderful little curtains as if they needed privacy.
Well, this is interesting to see, because this is the first, to my mind, this is the first point in the game where there is the suggestion that there is something else. You know, in this village that is ostensibly trapped in 18th century at most. It's all farmers and peasants. There's no real technology, and yet here there's electricity. There's surgical blinds, tables, tools. Something else is up here. And
It
that's
almost looks like an asylum as well.
Yeah.
With that rickety lamp and the curtains and the surgical tools, it looks like some sort of hospital you really don't want to be in.
That's part of the course of Resident Evil, though, because even the very first Resident Evil, which I don't know if we'd ever cover, because that's a mansion rather than a castle. I don't know, maybe that's splitting hairs. But even in that game, it was revealed in the latter portion of the game that there's actually a secret underground laboratory, and you wouldn't, there's no indication up until then really that that's happening. It's all just zombies, but there's actually a big network underneath it. So even in things like Harry Potter, and I'm sure there are plenty of other examples. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons sort of trades off this idea as well, that there's a great subterranean network or world of tunnels and cells and dungeons and monsters that belies what lies above. Below actually conceals some other darker history or some kind of traumatic past. And in Dimitrescu's case, it's people being bled to death, being tortured, being fed upon by its ghastly occupants. You can see here in some cases there have been it's collapsing, it's falling apart, entire holes blown through. So we make our way through this kind of dungeon come wine cellar. You can see here it's been patched up. I don't know if that would meet your standards if you were in a heritage sector, just planks propped up, just trying to hold it all together.
I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there are definitely places within castles where planks are the best use of conservation and preservation.
I mean, budgets are tight, I suppose, but in Dimitrescu's case, I mean, I don't know what the local economy is like in Resident Evil Village. It can't be great. All they seem to produce is livestock and a lot of crystals throughout the game. So you think that actually they could kind of afford to They could afford to patch it, modernise. But you can see it's all in ruin. But that's part of that.
But look where the ruins are.
Yeah, it's
in the last place that you're going to be. So it doesn't matter what it looks like.
Well, that's interesting because it's. I guess then that comes back to the whole gothic motif of behind that veneer of grandeur and respectability, there is a kind of crumbling facade. Yeah, figures who are moribund, who have grown past. They've almost outlived longevity, like the buildings themselves, but feeding off the life of others, drinking the blood, a la kind of Dracula, and even Elizabeth Báthory, is another famous, apocryphal figure in vampire lore. She, presumably, who Alcina is loosely based off as well. Do you know? Are you familiar with Elizabeth Báthory?
I know the name. I'm
not
familiar with her legend.
In short, from what I know of her whole thing was that she bathed in virgin's blood. So she would drain the blood of virgins, but rather than drink it, although I'm sure there are stories where she does drink it, my knowledge of it is that she used to bathe in it, and it would keep her kind of supple and young. Another famous female exsanguinator. They're figures of turpitude, but also of just, it's almost like they've lived so long that their morals and their scruples have just kind of just molded and disappeared and gone with them. They're almost animal, there's no empathy. And so the building kind of matches that. It's like a pathetic fallacy.
They also have a lot of ties to Oravia Castle, or Orava Castle, which is in Slovakia.
Right.
And that's where Nosferatu was based off of.
Okay, right.
So again, a dark vampiric castle, and on the outside it's very inviting, it's very welcoming, it's very fantastical almost.
Well, that's interesting because you see the Nosferatu connection even in, again, Alcina herself, because she has those long talons, those long claws. Of course, Nosferatu famously has his horrible little gnarly, unkempt nails. So you can definitely see what architectural and literary and I guess like cinematic influence they're drawing upon. There's definitely, that's the thing with castles, I guess. We could talk rather dryly, and we might well do in some cases about just the building itself. But often castle, to my mind, in order for something to qualify as a castle, it's not just the bricks and mortar in terms of in game terms. It has to have another set of motifs. It has to have other elements like, well, depending on the game, I don't know, knights, say, or dragons. And even here, even in Village, we have a dragon in the form of Dimitrescu's final form. We have traps and torture devices.
Yeah.
So it's very much like a kind of an image of castles as passed through games from different genres, from different media, and different cultures. It's just fascinating to me anyway. I don't know if it's fascinating to anyone else.
I mean, aside from me,
Except for
it's very fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, I mean that's encouraging. I'm glad I'm not the only one. I'm glad I haven't gone down a rabbit hole.
I would seriously have to rethink my entire career if I said, "Well, that's okay."
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah. Well, if we go on, we go through the courtyard. We are now we're now in one of the interiors. The first interiors you go into after kind of escaping that initial entrance hall. This is where we lead up to Dimitrescu in her kind of abode, in her which she calls Mother Miranda on the telephone. There's a bit of puzzle solving here. This is very much kind of, what would you say, this is sort of Baroque, Rococo kind of interiors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, all the gilding, all the elaborate features along the walls, making it almost like a 3D element. That's common and what you'd expect to find.
Again, very, very palatial. Not what I would have imagined when you say castle and you think of castles. And here in this room here with the kind of the bloodbath, the literal bloodbath. Again, very, very much like Batory. You have to solve this puzzle in order to go down into a kind of a flooded basement, into a flooded chamber. You go through here in order to get back outside onto the kind of like, what is this, the exterior balcony overlooking the village. What about those defences? What do you think about those defences? Those walls?
I mean, just look at them. You have the towers, you have the battlements, you have the curtain walls, you have the gatehouse. I mean, this is just stereotypical architecture you'd find with any castle, regardless of where it is. So they do a really good job. I mean, again, they did their homework when it came to the features that you would stereotypically find with them. But they also played very well into the audience. So they knew that fans of Resident Evil, gamers in general, and even some that are interested into the historical accuracy of it would play this game. And so they have something for everybody with it. Those that are architectural aficionados, or even those like me that are very much interested in castles, you have everything that you could possibly want, but then they play into the pop culture element of when people think of castle, what's the image that they have.
What is that thing on the ends that just sort of stick it out? Because you see this in everything, like Castlevania. I'm imagining Dracula's castle in Castlevania, and it has all these kind of appendages and all these bits that stick out and prop out. And these sort of strange little vestigial towers, they're kind of a conical bits.
They're called turrets.
Right, they are just turrets, okay.
Yeah, they're called turrets.
Okay.
There's a tower that just projects vertically out of a wall.
But what point does that serve? What is it? Is it ornamental? I mean, I guess in this case it would be ornamental, but is it?
It can be ornamental. It can be something like a little watchtower.
Okay.
It's not anything that you would sit there and go, oh, that has a huge defensive element to it, because it's very easily brought down.
Yeah, that's the thing. Again, vestigial is the term I use because it means it can just break off at any time.
But it is something that we see in castles a lot, and it's just sort of a place where you could, those that are garrisoning or those that are on patrol of a rampart, they could use as a watchtower. But it has various purposes, but a turret is very common. We do see the sort of gravity-defying ones, and my absolute favorite, and I will die on this hill, Hogwarts Castle.
Of course.
I'll die on this hill.
Of course. But we might well do Hogwarts at some point, because there are Harry Potter. Of course we can.
But yeah, we do see them in real life. We do see them in the fantastical, and it seems like every time we go into the fantastical castles that we see in games, movies, TV shows, what have you, they add their own little special bit to it. Castle Dimitrescu, it's still something that is very isolated. It's hard to get to.
Yeah,
like the rest of the castle.
Well, like outside of time, because I mean, in Hogwarts' case, it's supposed to be up in Scotland somewhere, isn't it? But there's some magic force.
Muggles can't find it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not a big Harry Potter fan. I can't confess to know, but even then, I know intuitively that it's somewhere almost in its own pocket dimension. It's outside of time, much like this is.
Much like Castle Dimitrescu.
I mean, even though I know this isn't like supernatural, it's outside of time because it's being protected or it's because it's being concealed for whatever reason, or it's in such a remote region of quote unquote Eastern Europe that it's just impenetrable and no one knows. So at this point, we go through a church chapel, a cathedral of some sort, where MacGuffin is held as going to dispatch Dimitrescu. And now we see, just to look back on it, these octagonal towers. Mm-hmm. You said they were...
You see them a lot in Eastern Europe. You'll see them in Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Romania. I could keep just naming the countries, but I won't. They're also common in other places in Western Europe, such as England. But it is a later design for them because it is aesthetic, really. It did have its groundings with the development of gunpowder, so we see it in the 14th century predominantly because it is a lot harder to bring them down versus a rectangle tower. We see the circular tower coming in.
Right.
But this just gives you more vantage points to sort of shoot from or see oncoming attacks from. It gives you a better view. Mm. But eventually they do become aesthetic. Mm. It's just a nice design to say, to have your architect sort of flaunt their skill that they do have the wherewithal to design such a tower and see it through. Mm-hmm. So it's a status symbol in the end.
And that's a good point to end on, I think. I mean, that's sort of, I think, what Dimitrescu epitomizes. To begin with, for our inaugural castle, is that these video game castles are just, what are they? They're symbolic of a gamut of emotions. It's a display, I think, on the environmental artist's ability to kind of create these credible spaces. In terms of like the castle as it stands today, or doesn't stand in the case of Wales, what do you think it epitomizes? Like, what do you think a castle means in this day and age, generally?
Escapism from reality. In this day and age, that seems to be the idea most people have. Mm-hmm. Again, different audiences have different ideas of what a castle sort of symbolizes. Mm-hmm. But I would say most generally it is an escapist ideology. Yeah. Because it takes you out of this everyday mundane life and takes you to, or transports you to this time or this place where people are proud of whatever cultural or some social aspect of their life. They're very proud of it and they want to show it off. So it's very, very much a place of grandeur, of theatrical design.
And I think that this game is very OTT. It's very much Grand Guignol, bloodfest going on. It's interesting that the castle is not just the backdrop, but it's your first port of call. So anybody who's on the fence and hasn't yet played it, there's our encouragement to go and give this a go and explore it yourself. And I'm sure we can tease out more of this idea of what a castle is and what it means in subsequent episodes. So
I think we have a pretty good idea of what those episodes would feature.
There's a lot of games with castles, so there's a lot of mileage we can get potentially.
Yeah. But it would be interesting to know sort of what elements you want maybe to feature in subsequent episodes. Yeah. Just to sort of tease out a little bit more.
Yeah. So let us know. Don't be shy. But for now, I want to thank you, Ali, for your time.
Not a problem.
For coming. You are the castle expert. This would just be a single hairy man in a room just raving to himself otherwise, like every other Let's Player. And thank you for watching. If you liked any of that, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. You can also keep up with us on social media by following the links below. Until next time, take care.